Okay, it looks like the live stream has started. We're going to give another minute for people to join in. Hope everyone is doing well. All right, so it's 2:02, so we're going to get started. Hello, thank you all so much for joining today's Facebook live stream. My name is Bradley Morgan, and I'm here to tell you about my new book, Frank Zappa's America, published by the wonderful folks at LSU Press. And today I'm going to share with you some background on how the book came together because I think it reveals how I was able to find this new scholarly perspective in how Frank's music fits in today's culture. And before I begin, let me just share with you that we have this really great discount code where you can save 40% off your purchase if you order Frank Zappa's America directly from LSU Press's website. You can check the comments for that, but the code is SAVE40LSU. Again, that's SAVE40LSU, and you can always check back to the comments here in the chat or on the Facebook discussion. And so, yeah, let's begin. So this book, Frank Zappa's America, is not a biography. It's more of a cultural and historical analysis and study, and it's not a hagiography as either, because as much as there's a specific image of Frank that I'm trying to convey to modern audiences, there's a lot to be said about the man, especially some valid criticism. And certainly, as much as I praise him, there are times where, I got to accept the limitations of his art. And so, yeah, there's the book, Frank Zappa's America. And take a look because this amazing cover was designed by Michelle Newstrom, who did an absolutely fantastic job. And the cover photo here of Frank was taken in 1985 by Ebbett Roberts, just around the time that Frank was becoming really vocal about his criticism against the Parents Music Resource Center and becoming more of a politically active figure. And Ebbett is this world-renowned rock and roll photographer who did a lot of great work capturing bands at CBGB during its heyday and has had exhibits in places like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Mopop in Seattle. And I think that photo is important because as I was writing the book and developing the concept for it, I had this very specific image of Frank that I wanted readers to get to know. Because when most people think of Frank Zappa, the image that usually comes to mind is this freaky looking long haired guy who made the weird music that you found in your dad's record collection. And, and Frank had been known for his provocative commentary throughout his career, but by the time this photo was taken for that's on this cover, his commentary was expanding beyond his music and driving his activism. Not just him speaking out against censorship, but also his voter registration drives and political advocacy. And it's a side of Frank that fewer people know, and it's something I wanted to change with this book. Before they even read the first page, this is the Frank Zappa that I wanted to get readers to know. And I'm very grateful to Ebbett for that photo because there was no photo I wanted in the book. This book is my attempt to capture Frank's essence that I see when I look at this photo. And so let me tell you about that essence and how that shaped how the book came together. Um, it's no exaggeration when I say that I truly did not understand this book until I was finished writing it. When I started thinking about the project, the vision I had for it was not very clear. All I knew was that I wanted to write a book about the political messaging in Frank's music, but I didn't have much more than that to work with. I knew what albums and recordings to cover, but it took some time to grasp just how to present them and what that narrative structure would be. Essentially, figuring out how to organize the book. And in writing about Frank's political messaging, the big questions on my mind were why Frank Zappa right now? How is this music relevant and why should anyone care? And in trying to figure out the answers to those questions, I really had to wrestle with this image of Frank and the public perception of him within our culture, both back then when he was alive, still making music, as well as his legacy now, 30 plus years after his death. And basically, for those who may be unfamiliar with Frank, there's really only three aspects that can be broken down about Frank. One, that he's a masterful guitar player and composer. Two, that he's a writer of satirical and provocative lyrics. And three, that he fought for free speech. And with these areas, I had to come to understand the misconceptions and limitations within each. And that helped me set the path on my beginning to write this book. And the first thing was that I didn't want to put a lot of focus on his skills as a musician. And I had some reasons for this. When I was set out to write the book, I wanted the book to shine a light on the little known and underappreciated aspects of Frank. And so much has already been written about the quality of his music. Writing about that tends to get into taste and aesthetic. And I just wasn't interested in those subjects. I'm not skilled enough as a music writer to make that argument compelling enough. And besides, music taste is very subjective, and I was more interested in exploring the aspects of his music and his commentary that spoke to what we all share in common, whether or not we know Frank's music or are fans. And essentially, I didn't think this book would have been effective if I made this aesthetic argument about Frank's music. Now, when it came to Frank's satire and his provocative lyrics, this was an area I was going to need to spend a lot of time with. Frank was criticized for his lyrics throughout his entire career. However, he was often his own worst enemy in that regard. He spoke in a lot of interviews and with journalists, and in those instances, he would never back down when it came to criticism and about his music, and would always defend it. And he could be rather abrasive and cynical when those subjects came up, which I can understand why he could be. But he would also take things a step further with this attitude of, so you think that's offensive? Well, gee, get a load of this. And there are certainly songs in his discography that I understand some people would find offensive and not enjoyable to listen to. As an example, in 1979, which is where the crux of this book kind of begins with, he released a song called Jewish Princess that was a single. It was a hit in some Nordic countries. And the song lampoons the stereotype of the wealthy, spoiled Jewish woman, and Frank was called out for it by the Anti-Defamation League as being anti-Semitic. And not only did Frank dismiss this criticism, he responded by saying he had a song for his next album that would do for Catholic girls what Jewish Princess did for Jewish women, and that was Catholic Girls for the album Joe's Garage. And in exploring and analyzing Frank's lyrics, I really had to wrestle with all the cultural baggage that came with them. And while there are some material in Frank's catalog that presents some really difficult listening, a lot of Frank's music, I argue in the book, is misunderstood by critics and even some fans by and large. In many of these songs, he's criticizing things like the class system that raises young men to become dangerous to society. In a lot of songs, he's condemning the influence of religion on American politics and how the direction of the Republican Party during Ronald Reagan's presidency would result in policies that would primarily hurt and target women and people of color. And that's where I focus on the book. But because of his particular style, sometimes this messaging would get lost in the density of his music, and he can express those ideas in rather indelicate ways. But I think I think a lot of his lyrics are either misunderstood or it's a critic who is trying to assert their taste as a gatekeeper and some kind of cultural arbiter. And Frank felt that way too, based on his general opinion of music journalists, which was rather negative. And this then builds into the third key aspect of Frank's legacy, which is his work as an advocate for the freedom of speech, which was something he was an absolutist about. He absolutely would never budge on his commitment to that value, not only as a musician and creative performer himself, but also as a regular American citizen. And through his music and his interviews with the media during the 1980s, he became really well known for championing this right to free speech. And that may explain why he could be so provocative in lyrics, kind of using them as this pressure test against this freedom he very much deeply cherished. And another way of saying that would be that he wanted everyone to be able to say exactly what they wanted, and so he could be sometimes intentionally provocative just because he felt like he could, and like as if this was almost his duty as an American citizen, to ruffle people's feathers. And the thing with that is, while his fight for free speech is largely seen as a positive thing within his legacy, and even begrudgingly among his most harshest critics, because he fought against putting warning labels on music albums, that conversation around that topic has drastically changed over the last 40 years. For younger generations, the people they see now who position themselves as champions and fighters for free speech are people like Elon Musk and Tucker Carlson, these people who are really rich right wing grifters who make money by stirring dissent on their platforms. And for some young people, there's this kind of growing idea that if those are the people who are fighting for free speech, then maybe there should be some restrictions on free speech if it causes people to say things that are racist, transphobic, homophobic, or sexist on social media or wherever else. And that makes me concerned as it relates to Frank's legacy because his motivations were much different and was rooted in rather progressive ideas. And with the criticism of Frank that exists out there about his music and lyrics, I didn't want to see Frank get lumped in with these other guys because his music, wasn't being heard in its proper context. So, taking in consideration like those three key areas of Frank's legacy, if I was going to write a book about his politics, I needed to not just shine a light on the least known aspects of his career and work as an artist, but I had to very conscientiously approach this topic in a very objective way. Basically, if I was going to praise Frank, I had to take in the entirety of his life and work, not just the good parts, but also the more difficult ones as well. And all this helped me move forward with further developing the concept for what would become the book. But there was still a point where I was unsure of what to do, of how to approach the subject and whether there would be enough for a book. And because I didn't understand yet how all these pieces fit together or what I would even say about them, I didn't want to get overwhelmed by the idea of starting a book that I may not have been able to finish. So I started small by writing an article. In September 2022, I had this article published in Pop Matters for this series where you write about the cultural significance of a single album. And for years, I've always wanted to write something about Frank Zappa's 1979 rock opera Joe's Garage because it's an album that's always fascinated me because it was the first one I discovered when I was in college. And even being new to Frank's music, I had come to know early on in my appreciation of him that he was this savvy political commentator because the album is an allegory to the Iranian Revolution and the Ayatollah banning music in Iran. And while other people's first experiences with Frank were the more well-known albums like Hot Rats or Apostrophe, which are largely praised for their instrumentation and they don't have the same kind of cohesive messaging that his later work like Joe's Garage would had. My early exposure to Frank was this side of him of being this socially conscious political commentator. And so to kind of dive into that example, for those who may not be familiar with the album Joe's Garage, allow me to share with you the details of the plot. And bear with me because buckle up, it's going to be a ride. So, the album is this story of a young man named Joe who wants to play in garage bands with his buddies, but after his band gets shut down over a noise complaint, the police encourage him to pursue wholesome church oriented activities instead of playing music. Except the church oriented activities aren't exactly wholesome, as it's where the girls learn to give the boys blowjobs under the supervision of this homosexual priest, portrayed by Zappa. And there, Joe meets this nice girl named Mary, and they spend time together holding hands. But when there's a touring rock band that comes to town, and on the album, the band is Toto, when they come to town, Mary abandons Joe to become a groupie for the band. And this causes Joe to become distraught. He ends up sleeping with another woman and gets an STD. And then he gets tricked into giving all his money over to the leader of this church called the First Church of Appliantology, which was a satire of Scientology. And the leader of that church convinces Joe that he is in denial about his sexual attraction to machines. So he encourages Joe to go to a club where he meets several robots that he accidentally destroys while having sex with them. And because of that, and they were government-owned property, he's thrown into a special prison that houses record executives, and these record executives all take turns sexually assaulting Joe. I think that's Zappa in putting some commentary in the music industry there. But by the time he leaves prison, the country has now made music illegal systematically in the Constitution, and Joe ends up giving up his musical ambitions by symbolically hawking the imaginary guitar in his head and gets this job working as an automaton in a muffin factory. So basically, the whole story, in Frank's words from the album, is about how music can get you pretty fucked up. And now, having said all that, I know it comes off as a really bizarre plot and with a lot of provocative elements that some people may not enjoy listening to. But it's an example where seemingly lowbrow art can have highbrow meaning because it's a work that offers a deeply rich satire about the ways in which personal freedoms can be systematically taken away by the government, influenced by extremist fringe groups. As I mentioned earlier, the album was an allegory to the Ayatollah banning music in Iran, and the reason why this spoke to Frank, besides being a musician himself, was because he saw how what was happening in Iran could also happen in the United States with the recent founding of Jerry Falwell's moral majority and the burgeoning influence that right-wing evangelical Christians and televangelists were having on national politics. And because of that, he was worried about how a minority fringe religious movement could impact the rights and freedoms for all Americans, especially those who didn't share the same beliefs and who, yeah, and while that's interesting on its own, and I had wanted to write about it for years, it took some time before I was able to because I hadn't yet answered the question of why an album like Joe's Garage is still relevant today. And unfortunately, the moment to that finally came to write about the album was when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade during 2022, effectively fulfilling this long-standing goal of the evangelical movement. So for the article, I connected the album's original intent with this modern turn of events where this fringe religious movement impacted the rights and health of millions of Americans. And from there, I was able to trace this through line from Joe's Garage until his death, where Frank created music that increasingly addressed the threat of evangelical influence in American government. And that article was later expanded for this book, which really helped me. It was an absolute breakthrough in refining this book's focus. Yes, Frank satirized a lot of elements within society, such as popular culture, unions, media. But by the late 70s and until his death in the early 90s, his criticism of evangelicals was what was shaping much of his musical commentary. And but that's not necessarily anything that's new. That's pretty common. That's known within the Zappa sphere already. He had been long known for taking on the right-wing Christian establishment. So what I needed to do was to break all of that down, revealing his motivations, his ideas and concerns, and the answer to why his music was still relevant, I felt, had to be found in what connected all of those things together. I needed to find out what that thread was, and by doing that, then I could present this fuller view of Zappa as a person and an artist. So I had all the pieces, but I wasn't sure how to put things together. And because Zappa recorded so much music, much of which was largely inaccessible before streaming because he had left his record label and then distributed his own albums, and that was in the 70s into the 80s, and so those albums didn't get as much press or play. And plus, he had this difficult reputation that I had to reconcile with, and I had to fill in what I felt were missing gaps within his legacy. And basically, when I started, I had no idea how to structure this book or even how to present the narrative because at this point, I was really beginning to understand why there had not been a major study of his political commentary. It really started, and the whole process was getting to be overwhelming. And to get past that and not to have the project stall, I told myself, you're a music writer, start there. And that's when I had this other major breakthrough when I started writing about this track called You Are What You Is. That's from an album of the same name, You Are What You Is, released in 81. And that was the song that really broke the book wide open for me. It's a song about cultural appropriation and who stands to benefit and lose from that. And so, if you're not familiar with the song, there are two characters in it. One's a white man and one's a black man. And the white man feels emasculated, so he adopts all these racist stereotypes because he believes he can gain respect from others by acting like some kind of a victim. But on the other hand, with the black character, he tries to make himself culturally wider by giving up certain foods and taking up golf. And at the end of the song, it all results in this call and response chorus with Ray White and Ike Willis, both two black men in Zappa's band, where the idea is that if there's something about your identity you don't like and you get rid of it, someone else will come along and assume it for themselves. And when that happens, whatever you had left behind will no longer be recognizable to you anymore. And in the book, I followed the path of each character to their most extreme conclusion as a way to explore Frank's commentary about racism in America. With the white character, his self victimization leads him to believing in replacement theory, which is driving a lot of white supremacist rhetoric today, and certainly can lead to racially motivated violence. And with the black character, his journey in the song is this Sisyphean effort because no matter what he does, he's always going to be a black man in America. And that song allowed me to delve into the current day issues surrounding white supremacy and the influence that it's having on our society, given that evangelical Christianity has now defined the platform for one of the two countries' major political parties. Uh, there's a music video online you can check on YouTube that's worth seeing because it's funny. It was banned from MTV because there's an effigy of Ronald Reagan that Frank Zappa electrocutes. So check out YouTube. You Are What You Is, and so that song "You Are What You Is" really was the fulcrum for refining the book's vision, so that it was more than just an accounting of Frank's political commentary, because it really opened the door for me why his messaging was relevant. And that was when I realized this book was going to shape out to be a commentary about race in America over the last 50 years through the lens of Frank's music. And the other chapters take that theme and push the concept further, really revealing the parallels between what Frank was addressing through his music back then and what's happening today. There's a chapter that explores his failed Broadway musical called Thingfish, which was this commentary on Reagan's silence and mishandling of the AIDS crisis that was serving as an allegory to how the United States had historically abused black men during the Tuskegee syphilis studies. There's a chapter on the Parents Music Resource Center that goes beyond Frank's testimony. I break down the testimony and the finer points of it, and and to do that, it reveals how parents' rights groups have evolved from the PMRC to ones like Moms for Liberty today, whose mission is to ban books and libraries that speak to the issues facing queer people and people of color. And then from there, the book then explores how Frank addressed the threat of Christian nationalism, beyond his music, through his political activism, doing things such as setting up voter registration drives at his concerts in partnership with chapters of the League of Women Voters in each of the cities he was touring. And there's even a live album where the opening track features some volunteers registering a guy to vote live on stage, and it's kind of funny to listen to. There's this older woman who's a volunteer named Alice Sheff, and she goes, "Oh, Frank, I knew you from the '60s. You haven't changed a bit." And he's like, "Oh, I've changed a little bit." And so then the book closes out covering his final orchestral works, which have their own relevant commentary, and also goes into how he came to learn that his music had made him a national hero throughout parts of the Soviet Union, and also goes into areas such as him befriending the president of Czechoslovakia and nearly becoming the country's cultural ambassador. So by then, I made my case for why I thought Frank's music was still relevant. Um, I know we don't have much time left to speak before we get to the questions. So the thing I want to end on is me saying that this isn't a book about what I think Frank would say about our culture now, and this is something I really drive home in the book as a point. You know, Frank has been dead for over 30 years, so we will never know what he would have thought of now. And what this book does is examine the issues that were current in his time that he addressed through his music, and then analyzes how those issues have since evolved to what they are today. And being the first person to write a book examining Frank's politics, it like initially felt weird, especially because I hadn't even turned 6 yet when he died. But since the book came out, I've come to realize that's been a rather my biggest strength, because it's allowed me to find a new way to view Frank Zappa's life and work and contribute to this cultural reevaluation that I think's been long overdue for him. So I feel like I captured the essence of the photo on the cover of the book that inspired me so much. And you can feel inspired by Frank Zappa too when you use the code SAVE40LSU to save 40% off when you purchase the book directly from the LSU Press website. So thank you so much for my Frank talk. I think we may
Sure.
have some questions or.
Yeah, I mean that's excellent introduction. Um, Tell us a little bit more about your background and how you. I know you talked about how the book kind of evolved on its own, but tell us a little bit about your background and what drew you both to music journalism as well this project.
So my background is I studied video production and I worked in a lot of media nonprofits and but I was never a writer. I didn't really write anything at all, and I wasn't actually even much of a reader until about 10 or 11 years ago. But in 2018, I there was I don't know if you there's this music book series called 33 and a Third, which are short little books on one album, and I decided I wanted to write a book on U2's The Joshua Tree as this exploration of this dichotomy of America, this concept of the promised land versus reality idea. And I ended up not getting picked for that series, but I felt like I had a really great concept with that. So I just continued working on it and I pitched it and it got published. But as the book came out, there was an element of it that I couldn't touch upon too much. So the book examines the Joshua Tree at the time of its release and then recontextualizes its relevancy 30 years later during the Trump administration when they toured it for its 30th anniversary. And because the book has to follow the album's theme of celebrating what makes America great, but also criticizing what it doesn't. There was this element of white Christian nationalism that served as like this underpinning of a lot of that, but it wasn't an area that I really could dive into, and it's something I was really interested in exploring. But then, and then at the same time, I had this idea in mind to approach Frank Zappa as a topic because sadly, I felt a lot of his music was relevant now in terms of the messaging, but there was also, he had that reputation, and I think there was a lot of reasons why he wasn't getting the cultural value reevaluation that I think he deserved. And so, wanting to pursue this theme of white Christian nationalism, but also wanting to elevate what I thought was valuable within Frank Zappa, it was just a journey to find the way to have those two topics intersect.
Interesting, interesting. Talk a little bit more about um, that. Well, you said the point that Zappa's music is still relevant, but you really, I think what you're meaning by that is because of the context and the messaging. So, is it really the music that you're talking about, or is it more the his activist kind of approach to music? You understand
Mhm,
what I'm
absolutely.
saying?
It is, I didn't mention at the beginning, wasn't wanting to approach this from an aesthetic or musical quality. Because when you pull up any kind of like guide, like there's this book called 1001 Albums to Hear Before You Die, or other best of kind of albums list, there's only a couple of albums that stand out as being like the ones that represent Frank's best work. That's Hot Rats, or his works with the Mothers of Invention, with Freak Out, out, We're Only in It for the Money. Those are the ones that tend to kind of crop up the most. And part of why the music I cover in this book, beyond just what it does to address the social and cultural issues of that time, the reality was this was his least critically successful and least commercially successful work. Uh, you couldn't really find these albums that well in the 80s. You had to, like, I especially order in some cases, or maybe go to special stores. So they never got their due in I think in any kind of cultural assessment. I think there's a lot of great work. This is where he kind of gets into more of a jazz fusion element as the 80s go on. And I think there's a lot of interesting aspects of it. Some of it is very difficult, and I mentioned the musical Thingfish, and it's difficult for a lot of reasons thematically, but there's also like not a lot of great music. He ends up reusing a lot of earlier tracks for that. So some of this work I wouldn't necessarily rate high on Zappa list, but it was about exploring the themes on those albums because the themes drove the music. Now, whether or not they're aesthetically as pleasing or significant as his other works, I'll leave that for other music writers, but in this evaluation of wanting to set the tone for Zappa by establishing the theme of the music, I hope then it gets people to visit those albums, to hear them for the first time, really, and contribute their voices to the quality of the music itself.
You talked a little about the jazz fusionist element in this era. So obviously, there's an evolution in terms of his musical style and throughout this. But what about in terms of the activist or the messaging that he's trying to get across? You talked about free speech and that always being omnipresent from the beginning to the end. But what about in other regards? Do you see evolution? Do you see him changing his stand over time, or within other aspects other than freedom of speech? What do you, how do you see that?
I don't necessarily see a changing in his stances. What I do see in his music is that as time went on, he increasingly became more vocal about who were causing a lot of these issues. Joe's Garage is an allegory. There's other songs in the early '80s that address televangelists specifically on the "You Are What You Is" album. There's tracks like "Heavenly Bank Account," um, "Dumb All Over" that specifically cite televangelists as being the ones who are driving this cultural change. And as time went on, he got to be more vocal by actually specifically naming the people in these songs. There's one track from this 1988 live album, Broadway the Hard Way, which has a chapter in the book. And it's in that album, that tour is the one where he did the voter registration drives. But he has songs where he specifically calls out people by name: Pat Robertson, Jimmy Tammy Faye Baker, and he's clear on making the connections of where he thinks the ideology is going. There's a track on that album that names them specifically called "Jesus Thinks You're a Jerk," and there's some, I think, some of the most interesting lyrics on that song are: "With a Ku Klux Moo in the back of a truck. If you ain't born again, they're gonna mess you up, screaming, 'No abortion, no siree. Life's too precious, can't you see? But what's that hanging in a neighbor's tree? Well, it looks like colored folks to me.'" And when I hear those lyrics, he's making clear connections that evangelical, this far right element in evangelical Christianity goes hand in hand with white supremacy. And these are the people who have the ear to the president. And so, what you find in terms of an evolution beyond just a musical evolution is that a more direct approach to calling specifically out who's causing this. There's another track on an album. The last album he released before he died was a largely orchestral album called "The Yellow Shark," and there's a track that is a reading called "Post-Industrial America." Sorry, it's called "Food Gathering in Post-Industrial America, 1992," and it's a reading from a woman named Hilary Sturt, who is I think she plays viola or violin on the ensemble, and she's kind of doing this reading describing this toxic, polluted wasteland where all like these factories and corporations have completely obliterated our environment, and we're all feral and wild and eating on whatever plastic we is available to us. But the final line of the reading, while they're setting up this environmental dystopia, the very final line of the reading is feeding on the body parts of abandoned wild children since the total ban on abortion a few years back. And so that's a recording that was in '92, released in '93. And it makes that clear connection that a lot of this destruction that you're seeing are being driven by the ones who are there to fundamentally take away your rights. And in a lot of these songs, Zappa clearly says it's the Republicans and the Reagan administration.
Well, that question started with the evolution. obviously there was an evolution that where he freed himself of the music industry and became, he exercised that, as you said, calling people out by name as he progressed in that. So do you think he saw himself as evolving from a musician, music being the first and priority, to more of an activist or more a larger role in terms of beyond music and music just being the vehicle?
I think it goes hand in hand. I mean, Frank often dismissed his own lyrics in a lot of cases. He felt, and I think that was just him being cynical and just kind of a defense mechanism. But he kind of would just dismiss lyrics as being just part of the way to hear the music. But while the focus on the book is from like the late 70s until his death, I didn't want people to think that if they had this impression of Frank as this really offensive provocateur, that, oh, he had a moment where he realized, you know, he had this vision and he had to pursue it, and that this was something that would just came out randomly in his career, which is not necessarily true. There's an introductory chapter that where I break down his first three studio albums that he released with the Mothers of Invention. Freak Out in 66, Absolutely Free in 67, and We're Only in It for the Money in 68, all of which are really highly regarded for the commentary that they present. There isn't that Christian nationalism element yet because that wouldn't come about till the late 70s with the rise of the moral majority. But there's songs on there that address the issues of their day. One example from Freak Out is the track Trouble Every Day, which was inspired by the Watts riots. And in the whole song is an exploration of how the media exploits racial violence to cause dissent and discomfort among certain members of the white population, like conservatives who might be concerned watching their TVs and seeing storefronts being burned. And in the book, I make the connection to to what happened after the murder of George Floyd and how footage of largely peaceful demonstrations would get reused in political campaigns by conservatives and far right Republicans who are running for office, kind of exploiting that. And so when his music career began, he had a very strong socially conscious beginning to it. By the end of the 60s, throughout the 70s, he didn't really release any albums that were large cohesive messages. He had kind of songs peppered throughout. But while those albums in the 60s were a response to a conservative counter-revolution that was going on during the Johnson administration, he stepped away doing these albums with these kind of cohesive themes to then returning to that when this other conservative counter revolution was coming in the form of Christian nationalism.
Yeah, there was a comment in the comment sections by Frank, ironically enough, and he kind of drives that point home. He says Frank's disdain for and occurrence of racism was, I think, a lifelong issue. He voiced his views, especially on Freak Out, and specifically in the song "Trouble Every Day" about the Watts riots in '65. And then he quotes the lyrics, "You know something, people, I'm not black, but there's a whole lot of times I wish I could say I'm not white." So it kind of reinforces that point that you're saying about that being an issue throughout Frank's career. Um, Change speeds a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about your sources and the research and the writing? A lot of because we're an academic press, a lot of it's done in the archives, but it doesn't seem like that's the case here. So can you talk a little bit about your process and the sources that you used?
Well, certainly there was an archive of sorts that I used. So I wrote the first draft of this book, and it was a solid first draft of this book in about 6 months. And it's a pretty decently sized book. And so I mean I work a full-time job, and so to be able to manage that and to write this book, I I really benefited from the work that a lot of Zappa fans have put together over the years. And there's an archive of his like all like his press, like every interview he did, every article, that he did on this website called afka.net, AFKA.net. And there's full transcriptions of all the articles and interviews. There's scans of all the source material, so I could even go in and get the page numbers. And that was put together by an Estonian man named Evo Raup. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And I was sure to thank him in the book and to send him a copy because this book would not have come together as smoothly or quickly as it would have if if for not for all the work that he put in the years and other volunteers who put that in the years. And so I did feel a little bit that I wanted to make sure that the work that came out of this was was something that would feel validating for the work that they put into their archive. And so certainly to write something that is presenting Frank in a new and fresh way, in order to convey his longevity as a figure, I owe a huge debt of gratitude to them for that.
Excellent, excellent. Um, we often ask this question of our authors: was there something in the research that surprised you or shocked you? I mean, dealing with a subject like this, there's a lot of shocking things in there, but it was intentionally shocking. But was there some things that surprised you? Maybe a stand that you wouldn't have expected Frank to take, or something like that?
Not necessarily a stand that I would expect Frank to take. He's very consistent, but he has interesting ways on presenting his argument. And one example is the PMRC. Even if you only have like a fleeting like view of Frank, his testimony to the Senate committee about the issue of putting warning labels on albums, it's always kind of remembered as him, as this big anti-censorship speech. And there's like clips that get pulled from his speech where there's like a comment like, are you going to put a Star of David on any albums with Zionist messaging? And when I went through the speech and then other recordings with him in political panels, he is really amenable to suggestions that were presented. He had no issue with providing consumers more information to help them make better choices. He had no problem with having the albums print lyrics or have materials be available for parents. And there's even some conservative senators on that panel who vocally agree with him on it. His concern, though, and what kind of made his argument really smart, was that he was trying to get people to understand that this whole culture war issue about porn rock or inappropriate lyrics on albums or warning labels on albums was meant to legitimize the passing of a of this tax that was going to make up for lost revenue in the music industry as it related to piracy. So it was going to add a tax to blank tape. I think like I don't know how many pennies per inch or whatever, but he was really concerned that the American public was sold this culture war issue, but instead being given this private tax that would have been levied on them. And so his approach was very well thought out in trying to drive home this you're trying to put a tax on people that they're not consenting to or not voting to. And about the materials and the ways that parents could be more informed consumers. His only concern was just that he didn't want the taxpayers to pay for it. His concern was, how do we get this funding? And I thought that was very interesting. And certainly the legacy is kind of shaped funny because so there's this oral history that Newsweek did. The guy who did the oral history is named Zach Schoenfeld, for the 25th anniversary of the PMRC. And there's comments from Susan Baker and Tipper Gore who talk about how rude Frank Zappa was throughout everything, but that was his argument. But they also praise John Denver's role in the PMRC, and he actually was saying that what you are doing is akin to the Third Reich burning books. But history, Frank's the, ugly, abrasive guy, so he's got to, take the heat a little bit more. But his argument was a lot more refined than just being purely anti-censorship.
That's interesting because you talked about the some of the earlier interviews where he really held his ground and he would get reactionary, if you think that's offensive, and then he would say something, take it over the top. And so when it came to this point where it was really important, he actually was a little bit more flexible. Uh,
Absolutely. And there's another point in the book that kind of goes into that as well, because there's quotes of Frank that from the 60s where he talks about we have to get rid of the federal system and destroy it from within. But Eval Raup, who manages that archive, he had interviewed one of someone who played with Zappa sometime in the 80s when he was starting to, rev up his voting advocacy, and I can't remember the bandmate who Avo interviews, but he was saying, yeah, Frank made friends all the time with police, with politicians, because you needed to, I don't want to say befriend the system, but find inroads in the system to be able to change it from within. So kind of moving away from that really radical language of the 60s to, okay, there's a systematic approach to this and it requires participation on a variety of different levels.
Excellent, excellent, fascinating all around. One question we like to close on is, what are you working on next? What project are you enmeshed in now?
So I actually have my third book comes out in October, on October 7th. It's a coffee table book on U2 for their 50th anniversary, called U2 Until the End of the World. And it's a full-on 1976 to now history of the band, breaks down every single song. It tells a story of four friends, four brothers, and that journey that they go on together. And having written about U2 before from a more analytical and you know, historical and lyrical analysis to going to just the celebration is a lot of fun. So I've got that, and then I interview music book authors for a academic podcast consortium called the New Books Network. It is the largest podcast network completely dedicated to books, where authors interview other authors on a variety of different topics, and so I interview authors with that. I don't have any new book plans. Hopefully something will happen. Certainly writing books is hard, and my first two were very unique ideas that took rather a long time to kind of for me to make sense. I'm open to whatever's happening next.
Well, we certainly appreciate the work that you do with the New Books Network. That's a great series. Well, that's it. And if you wanted to wrap things up,
Oh, yeah, just if you want to save 40% off a copy of Frank Zappa's America, go to LSU Press's website and use the code LSU. What's the code? Save 40 LSU?
save 40 LSU.
Save 40
And
LSU.
it's in the
And and
comments.
and thank you all so much for those who are watching and tuning in. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for your interest, for your curiosity, and for your open-mindedness, and just for making this journey what it is for me. I really truly appreciate it.